report. As an economist, I actually more attuned towards more statistical and economic reports that actually bear strong statistical and data support. And I tried to balance it with what many WP MPs have suggested, that housing is unaffordable for Singaporeans. And the leader of opposition too had echoed similar sentiments, calling for the government to intensify efforts in making the public housing more affordable and accessible. So I was surprised when I came across this report as I was trying to assess and prepare this speech on the issue about housing affordability and cost of living. So more recently, I was looking at the issue and found that this report in January, where WP MP Mr. Louis Chua, put out a considered professional view in a report which was carried in the media, saying that housing in Singapore is affordable. In fact, if I may quote him in his report, what was interesting, Mr. Louis Chua and his co-authors reported and said that despite cooling measures, a $1 million home in Singapore is estimated to be affordable for households on an overall average household income in Singapore. A $1 million home is estimated to be affordable for households on an overall average household income in Singapore. This is what he and his team of property analysts said also. He anticipated that, in quote, the global housing slump will deepen in 2023, yet he expects that the converse in Singapore with a modest price growth of 3 to 5%. Despite broadly higher rates, his scenario analysis suggests affordability continues to be healthy for the average household, given wage growth momentum amid tight labour market. And then on page 13 of his report, he and his co-authors went on to say this: contrary to the private property market, he finds a more favourable and resilient situation in the public housing market, i.e. HDB. This is largely attributed to the rise in the average income in relation to the price of a flat. He consistently estimated an MSR that stayed comfortably below 30%, bestowing upon households the freedom to still take up other loans. Therefore, he is inclined to believe that HDB markets should continue to remain resilient, supported by healthy household balance sheets. And then on the regional front, on page 26 of his report, he then assessed Singapore and our ASEAN region and said this, in quote, from a regional perspective, he notes that the affordability continues to be healthy in Singapore, where residential price increases have lagged behind that of household income growth over the last decade, whereas the converse is true for neighbouring ASEAN countries. Higher relative affordability for the general population of Singapore adds to the relative stability and resilience amid a rising environment globally, closing quote. So as a trained economist, central bank economist before, I was somewhat attuned to the property report that Mr. Louis Chua and his co-authors highlighted, which is somewhat in line and supported by data as well. So if that is Mr. Louis Chua's, I was wondering if that is actually indeed Mr. Louis Chua's professional opinion in January 2023, then it seems odd. As I try to reconcile, as I try to prepare my speech as well, it seems odd that he and WP say something else in Parliament in the February housing motion. So I just want to highlight sort of that story as the story goes as I prepare my speech going forward.
I just wanted to ask through you to basically to put into the context, the report that he was referring to was produced for institutional investors in a commercial context for the investment decisions. And I think if you look at the key conclusions that have been put forth in the report and what I have shared as recent as earlier this afternoon, in that the key constraint that I was speaking about is really the fundamental demand-supply imbalance issue. I spoke about how demand has been resilient, BTO subscription rates, private property take-up rates have been very high, and even the number of marriages have outpaced the number of BTO flats available on the demand side. And similarly, on the supply side, I also spoke about how, in terms of the private property market, the number of unsold units is at an all-time low, and similarly, the number of BTO launches has actually been lower than what it was, say, 10 years ago. And so, if you look at the demand-supply picture, I think that was consistent in what I have talked about in the last 2 months. If you look at the affordability that was...
Mr. Chua, it's a clarification, not to repeat what you had said earlier.
Okay.
I think if you wanted to highlight the seeming discrepancy between what was in the report and what you have said.
Yes, correct. So essentially, in terms of the report, the private property prices continuing to rise may be seen as a healthy investment opportunity to some, but from our national interest, I wonder if Mr. Saktiandi would agree that, especially as an economist, if you have house prices not conforming to, in a way, economic norms, whereby with rising interest rates, house prices typically should fall, but yet it continues to be very firm, would that not be a concern from a national interest standpoint versus an investment decision standpoint? Thank you.
I'd like to thank Honourable Member Mr. Louis Chua earlier for his clarifications. I duly recognize the report is meant for institutional clients, as he mentioned, but the professional assessment and conclusion in the report is very explicit. Public housing in Singapore today remains affordable. I think I've highlighted the quotes just now. Indeed, it is affordable because of the government policy. So I'm glad that Mr. Chua agrees with us on this matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Louis Chua.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to member for his clarification. And I just again want to reiterate that if he looks at the report, the key conclusion there really is that the key issue which I highlighted consistently across is that it is really a matter of demand supply, and what may be favourable from an investment perspective may not exactly be favourable from a national interest perspective.
Mr. Saktiandi Supaat, do you want to respond?
Speaker, I just want to reiterate again my same points. Bottom line is that Mr. Chua's report explicitly states public housing in Singapore is affordable, and that Mr. Chua's professional assessment, we are glad to have his agreement on this matter. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.